Hello there. Uh, New lecture. Today I want to talk to you about culture, context, and ethics and the application of that in psychotherapy and counseling. Obviously, we're going to primarily concentrate on counseling since that's our degree. There's a difference between psychotherapy and counseling. We're going to explore some foundational topics in both, primarily again counseling. And again, this is going to deal with culture, context, and ethics, particularly ethics. They're really not separate, they're interconnected, and they help shape therapeutic interactions. So let's start with some definitions very quickly. Psychotherapy, that's a structured professional relationship between a clinician and a client, and it's aimed at improving mental health, emotional functioning, and overall well being. Now, it's not that much different from counseling, but let's look at counseling because that's what our engagement is in. So, counseling is similar, but it's more focused, and this is the big difference. It's more focused on specific life challenges, decision making, adjustment issues, uh, and it's shorter term. And that shorter term applies this way in several ways, actually, but I think the most recognizable is the fact that counseling is dealing with the here and now. You come to see me, and we're going to deal with what's going on right now. I'm not going to ask you, okay, so how was it 10 years ago? Because that's probably going to be, for our purposes in counseling, irrelevant unless there's some kind of powerful connection. And then you may have to refer to a psychotherapist. So we'll get to that later if we have time. But in the meantime, just mull over those two definitions. One is more more encompassing, which would be psychotherapy, than counseling is. So what's our central idea for today? Therapy doesn't happen in a vacuum. Every interaction you have is influenced by culture, its cultural meanings, contextual realities, and ethical responsibilities. Our class is on ethics. Um, there's no time when, probably no time, when you could eliminate culture as a factor in counseling. Bearing in mind, culture is more than just different ethnicities, different races. There's a lot more to culture than that. So you really can't remove culture from the picture. So let's look at this beginning with psychotherapy. And we'll start with culture. Culture is defined as a shared system of meanings, beliefs, values, norms, and practices. And those things are passed down across generations within a group. Now, what does it include? I've mentioned these: race and ethnicity, religion, gender identity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, ability and disability. We have a Christian slant to our degree because this is pastoral counseling, but yet we still have to consider gender identity. We have to consider sexual orientation because these things that we may find uncomfortable. But unfortunately, for the time being, it is what life is. Sal, considering that we have to relate this to what's known as cultural identity. Complicated thing. It refers to an individual's sense of of belonging to one or more cultural groups. So you're not looking at a narrow focus here. It's not singular, it's not fixed. It brings us actually to another term, intersectionality. Intersectionality is a description of how it's a description of multiple social identities, race, gender, class, and how they interact to shape a person's lived experience. A very important thing, this lived experience. That's what you're doing right now. You do it every day. And this can include things like privilege or oppression. That's incredibly important to consider. For example, a black person is not simply the son of race plus gender. It's really an intersecting experience. So you have to understand the perceptions of the people that you're dealing with. You also have to understand enculturation, learning your original culture, and acculturation, adapting to a new or dominant culture. I'm not going to go into examples. These are pretty obvious things. Enculturation, learning your own culture, and then acculturation, adapting to a new or dominant culture. How important is that? We live in a dynamic world. People move. One minute you're living in Europe, the next minute you may be living in Australia, whatever. Why does culture matter in psychotherapy? It shapes how distress is experienced and expressed. You've got to understand this. We can't pigeonhole people. We can't clump. You have to understand individuality here. This is known as idioms of distress. It's a concept. Specific ways of expressing psychological suffering. For instance, in some cultures, depression may be expressed primarily through physical symptoms like fatigue, pain, rather than emotional language. But you're going to hear it both, but this is just an example of how this works. And then there's another very critical concept, and it's stigma. Negative beliefs or attitudes about mental illness that can prevent a person from seeking help. I will not give you any identifiable information, but I dealt with a student not too long ago who comes from a family, I'll put it that way, with a psychologist as a member. And this student was having some depressive presentations and went to, this is not an American culture, by the way, went to that family member and asked for assistance. And the family member said, I will talk to you about it, but don't you dare tell anybody that you're having this problem. And she was told that, the student, because in that culture, it's not acceptable to be weak mentally. It's looked down upon. It's a very different world. Here are some cultural things to consider along with what I just described to you. And you have to learn these things. If you're dealing culturally with people, and you probably will be, you have to know these little minor tidbits. For instance, avoiding eye contact in some cultures is a sign of respect. If you do it in, like America, avoiding eye contact can be interpreted as either avoidance or lack of engagement, and it could be looked at as disrespect. You got to ask yourself, am I interpreting behavior accurately? in a counseling session? Or am I looking at this through my own cultural eyes? Hope all this is making sense so far. This is complicated stuff. Let's deal with some contextual factors, in counseling. So we're going to expand a little bit from culture to context. Context is the broader environmental, social, political, historical conditions that shape a person's life. And in our case, it's going to be clients. We use this thing called ecological systems theory that looks at multiple layers of influence. And let's look at these individually, these layers of individuality that make up this ecological thing. This is somewhat similar to Bronfenbrenner's, actually, it's taken from Bronfenbrenner's theory. Urie Bronfenbrenner, if you're familiar with him, look him up if you're interested. So here's what he says. Here's what ecological systems theory says. Microsystem, that's immediate environments like family and school. Keep in mind that these things interconnect. There you go, little hand language there. Mesosystems, microsystems feed and support mesosystems. What is that? Interaction between those environments, the microsystem and the mesosystem. These are more how can I put this and not confuse you? Micro and mesosystems. This is more personal. The personal aspects of culture. The exosystem, the third system in this layer, is indirect. Its influences like the parent's workplace, etc. Things that aren't necessarily connected as occurring within the home. I'm not going to get into things like working from home, okay? Because there are always exceptions to the rules in psychology. And finally, the macro system. That's a broader concept. That's cultural values. That's laws, societal norms. And here's another area. What's normal? Big question. It's society directed. So here are these ideas, these systems that interconnect to form the ecological system. Urie Bronfenbrenner's work. There's another concept that you can include here. It's called social determinants of health. That would be things like income, education, housing, access to health care. These significantly impact mental health outcomes. So that's why we call them social determinants of health. There's a psychosomatic idea here that poor mental health can cause poor physical health. It's a known thing. There's another thing. I'm giving you a lot of terms, I realize that, but these are important. Marginalization. It's systemic exclusion of certain groups from power and resources. Now, this is a controversial area. It gets political. It gets belief-based. We think about marginalization. If you're looking at that from a liberal standpoint, I think you're all familiar with the problems associated with that. Marginalization, from a Christian standpoint, I think would be more of a concern related to salvation. I'm not going to give you information related to swaying you into any belief system. We have a belief system. It's called Christianity. So that's our guiding light here with these things like marginalization. And then another thing, privilege, unearned advantages that are usually based on a person's social identity. Where do they fit into that that aspect. We can use examples to help illustrate that. Let's use anxiety as the problem, and since for me, I deal a lot with college students because that's my work. And a college student would come to see me who's suffering anxiety and seeks counseling. If I ignore the, excuse me, if I ignore the context, I might diagnose this as an individual problem. But if reviewed in context, then I need to consider these kind of things: financial pressure, family expectations, potentially language barriers, and in cultural conflict. I won't go off base here, but when a person moves into a new culture different from their own, they have options. Some of these are forced, though, but the final decision is made by the person, and that includes things like assimilation. A person who adopts themselves into the new culture. In other words, they leave their former culture behind, their original culture, and they try to become a member of this new culture. They assimilate or they accommodate, where they maintain aspects of their original culture, but they also include aspects of the new culture. And then there's some who reject. They reject the guidelines of the new culture and maintain their original cultural guidelines, and that can lead to anxiety. It's a problem because you don't get accepted by the members of your new culture if you reject that. So that adds to the anxiety. I would need to ask this person about stuff like financial pressure, about family expectations, I would need to recognize language barriers, and I would need to know about this cultural conflict, this assimilation / accommodation, etc. So is this pathology that this person is suffering a reasonable response to an environmental stress or stresses? That's a toughie. Let's throw some more dirt in the game. Let's talk about ethics. So I'm dealing, and you're being trained as a master's seeking student to plug in aspects. You're basically being taught to use analytical thinking, which I'm sure you already know, but this is just an extended version. I want you to consider some things here related to ethics, related to all the stuff we've been talking about. What are ethics? Probably already know by now. Principles that guide professional conduct, principles that guide decision making. An ethical dilemma occurs when there are competing values or principles and no clear right answer. This is where analysis becomes paramount. So let's look at some core principles to help you with this. In counseling, we refer to these as the core ethical principles. That's the main label for this. Let's begin with autonomy. You respect the client's right to make their own decisions. That's tough because they are potentially there because they made bad decisions. So still, you have to allow them that autonomy. We don't force things down a client's throat. The next is beneficence, excuse me. Promoting the client's well-being. Sorry about that. And that's an ethical thing. I have to make sure that I'm doing the right things, that I'm not causing harm, in other words. Non-maleficence, avoiding harm. If I mispronounce some of these words, I apologize. Been a rough night. Justice, it's ensuring fairness and equity. And finally, fidelity, maintaining trust. Fidelity is maintaining trust and professional responsibility. So in multicultural counseling, these things can come into tension because of all these other background things we've talked about. Autonomy, for example, might conflict with cultural values that prioritize family decision making. What are we looking at here? We're looking at maybe differences in individualistic cultures compared to collectivist cultures. So let's throw a few more terms in here. Cultural competence, the ability to understand and effectively work with cultural differences. Cultural humility, an ongoing process of self-reflection. Very simple. It includes things like openness and learning from clients. How do you learn from clients? You ask questions. Very simple. How about implicit bias? That's an unconscious attitude or attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding of behavior. So what do we have to do here? We have to guard against ethnocentricity. I doubt very seriously, for those of you who are pastors, that you have ethnocentricity as part of your makeup. That's basically rejection of a person from another culture simply because they're different and in adopting the attitude that they're inferior. That's a very, very commonplace attitude, unfortunately, in many societies. And then finally, informed consent, ensuring clients understand fully the nature, risks, and benefits of treatment. A client doesn't come to you, boy, I better not say that because I may be misspeaking. Let me say it this way. You're going to have some clients that come to you with the idea they can't be healed. They're going to do a lot of the healing on their own too, so keep that in the back of your mind. And I want to throw examples in this throughout our discussion today. Let's say you have this ethical dilemma. You have a client from a culture where arranged marriage is normal. What would your first thought be? Most likely you're going to be thinking that it's coercive. So what do you ask? You ask this of yourself. Are we imposing our own cultural values? When does respect become complicit to harm? That's ethical stuff that's very complex. You don't apply ethics mechanically. You have to be thoughtful, culturally informed, and analytical enough to make judgments. Why is this person coming to me because they're having some marital upheaval, even though they aren't married yet, because this is a forced marriage? So, tough one. I wouldn't even ask you to figure that out yet. Maybe at the end of your curriculum. And it's going to be tough even then. So, let's get to the meat. Practical skills. for culturally responsive therapy. That's your heading. Here we go. How do you apply all this in practice? That's what this is all about. Okay, we got to start with some more definitions. I'm sorry. Cultural responsiveness, the ability to adapt therapy to align with a client's cultural context. It's not easy. Reflexivity, ongoing self-examination of your own beliefs, your own biases, your own assumptions. Oh my goodness gracious, we all have biases we struggle with. That's part of the Christian battle, is taking control of those things and getting rid of them. Whew. Tough to do. I'm not preaching to the choir. Here's some skills to help you with that. Self-awareness. You got to be continuously undergoing self-examination, particularly in your own cultural assumptions and biases. Again, keep in the back of your mind ethnocentricity. We all have to battle these spiritual things. Includes hatred. Another core skill, culturally informed assessment. Don't rely solely on standardized tools because they may not be valid across cultures. You have to ask questions of the client about what's going on and include things like, what does this experience that you're having is causing you this trouble mean in your community? Like to go back to the example I used early about the student who was struggling with asking me for counseling because she had asked a family member who's a psychologist and was told, keep it quiet. Tough. Another skill in our core system, culturally, let me say it a different way because it's culturally oriented, communication competence, but that competence includes cultural understanding. So verbal and nonverbal communication. And where do you learn this stuff, by the way? A lot of it's learned through experience. Eye contact, silence, emotional expression. These things are not readily available to you. There's some courses you'll have in our curriculum that are going to help you with that, but a lot of this is going to come from experience. Where else might you get this? How about fellow counselors? You're also you have that avenue because you're going to need this out of school input to help you with some of this communication business, and that's called collaboration. So there's another way of doing that, by the way. Put the client in the position of expert in terms of their own cultural experience. It's okay to ask questions. How do you feel about eye contact? How does your culture define that, for example? You can ask things or say things like, help me understand your background. My understanding of your background helps me help you. It's going to shape this experience for us. Hope that makes sense. Now, let me use some practical application here. I've inundated you with definitions and concepts. Let's look at some case examples, and I'll give you as much as I can give you here legally. So here, these are true cases. 28-year-old female from a collectivist cultural background, what does that mean? That means what you do affects your community, because that's the way that's a collectivist cultural's approach to living. You do what you're doing to benefit everybody else, and it works that way throughout the community. So here you have a 28-year-old female from a collectivist culture, and she's experienced anxiety. She's torn between pursuing independence or meeting her family's expectations. So here's what you got to think about. You got to think about the aspects of cultural identity. How relevant are they in this case? How does intersectionality play a role? What contextual pressures is she facing? And then what ethical principles might be in tension? I'll let you struggle with that. Come up with your own answers. There's no single correct answer. I'll give you that hint. What do you need to do? You need to practice thinking in a culturally and ethically informed way. Go back through what we've talked about, these core values, these core skills, I should say. So, with all that in mind, here's what we've done today. We've explored key concepts, and these include culture, context, intersectionality, cultural humility, and ethical principles. Culture invades everything. Therapy is never culture free, period. As a clinician, a counselor, we're not going to be clinicians, by the way, unless you go through licensure. That's another discussion for another day. You don't need to be licensed to be a pastoral counselor within the confines of your church. We'll be talking about that in different classes. But what are you responsible for? Whether you're a clinician or not, you're responsible for understanding cultural influences. You have to recognize contextual realities. And you have to practice ethical and reflective care. That's true if you're in a clinic or if you're in your office as a pastor or pastor's assistant or whatever it is. Those are things that you're responsible for in order to be an effective counselor. So, think about this. What assumptions do you bring into a therapy room, or will you? Hopefully, your training that you'll receive in this degree will clarify most of that, and then consider how those things might shape your clinical decisions. I hope this is good information for you. I know it is. I hope you digest it, and we'll be meeting again soon.